this session was set aside a bit more informally as a database roundtable, which means that we've covered out any great plans that might entail. But the event was...
I see from big country in a big country. It's very short this afternoon. Now, if you're looking for a podcast where nothing is off limits when it comes to love and dating...
And you might have to ask them to mute. Okay. Not to mention any names. So, we were, when we, Tamsin conceived this event some time ago, we were sort of ambitiously hoping we were going to be able to launch a New South Wales version of the sort of materials that have been underway in Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania for some time. A few things have interrupted there. One is COVID, which made it very, very difficult for us to sort of meet with technicians and actually get the database happening. So what we did during COVID is we sat down and we did data. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of data, which we have yet to sort of really determine how we're hooking that up. But part of UNE's plan is to employ Hamish very soon to really start getting some momentum behind that project. The other thing that held it up is that we haven't really had proper consultation with communities, particularly vibrant local history societies such as this one. And so we're sort of now beginning to sort of talking to you about what we can do, but also what you're doing and what you want, what sort of things can our research do for you. So that's the purpose of this roundtable. We've allocated a very generous hour and a half. I don't mind if it's a little bit shorter because I'm already thinking about afternoon tea. But depending on how everyone feels, we can sort of compact the program a little bit more. But I think for starters, Hamish might warm us up by showing us a few more of the things that are going on with the data project in Tasmania. Hamish, you want to just continue on?
Yes, I will do. Thank you very much. And I think Perry is going to come up here in a bit as well, because Perry's on the board, is that right?
I think it's more a committee than a board.
She's on the committee of the Biographical Database of Australia, which I think is going to be a key part of anything that we do moving forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just telling you about a project that I've been involved in, which I think is the most amazing project that I've worked with in recent years. And you can see the outputs on the screen at the moment. So I'm going to tell you who she is and who the boy is, or the bloke that looked a bit like Clark Gable that I had on the other slide. And then I'm just going to go through some of the issues that we've encountered in Tasmania and where our thinking is going. Interrupt me at any point if you have a question. The idea is to drop some things in there which are points of discussion for moving forward. So who is this? Well, meet Caroline Wilkinson. I'm fortunate enough to have worked with Caroline. This is the woman who reconstructed the face of Richard III. Do you remember when Richard III was... here she is reconstructing the face of somebody else from the War of the Roses. This is a professional soldier that was found in a mass grave. You will see that the injury that killed him sliced through his skull, but he also has a former sword wound through his jawbone. So he's of really great interest because he survived a really critical blow through his jaw earlier in life, and she is reconstructing that face. So how did I get to work with Caroline? I'm going to get there by showing you this amazing 19th century thing. This is a database. It's a Bertillon cabinet invented by Alphonse Bertillon in order to try and keep track of details of criminals. So it's got pictures, photographs of them, and then it's got the shapes of their ears. And then the idea is that you pull out the ear shape and the eye shape and all the rest of it, and you get a list of people, names that have those characteristics. Now, Bertillon was very much influenced by two people, Cesare Lombroso, the Italian father of criminology, modern criminology, and this person, Francis Galton, who I always find pretty scary. He was a major eugenicist, but he also was obsessed with criminals, and he thought that crime was hereditary. He thought that it would be possible to take 25 photographs of a burglar and layer them one over the other so that the police could catch burglars before they committed their crimes by revealing the traits of a burglar. So he abandoned the experiment pretty quickly. And the reason why I abandoned it is because if you take 25 photographs of people of the same ethnic background and roughly the same age and sex, you end up with Hollywood sex gods. So what you're looking at is composite pictures of late 19th, early 20th century Tasmanian criminals. I think it's a way out there example of the kind of things that we can do. But yeah, this is much, much more than playing around just with stats. There's all kinds of things we can play around with. Sensi Lab, who are a unit at Monash University I work with, can tell me that they can now animate these and make them speak to us, which is just unbelievable. There is the opening page of the Tasmanian convict database that we've put together. We're very happy to give Port Macquarie access to it. The reason why we don't make it publicly available is because as a group of researchers, we do not have the time to answer queries from people and to go and check to see whether an entry that somebody thinks is incorrect actually is incorrect. It was put together as a research tool. The data, when it's cleaned, coded, and checked, then gets elevated into the Tasmanian Name Index, which is the archival portal for the Tasmanian Archives. But it's a kind of research tool, 78,000 convict lives in parallel. But there are 1.7 million records in the database as a whole. The link with the archives, I think, is critical. It's critical for two reasons. I think it gives everybody access. And I think that's a really, really important principle. If you're going to trust somebody else with your data, you should trust everybody with your data. If we're going to share stuff, then we need to have an agreement. Well, what are we doing this? Surely that we should be sharing it with the nation. Now, the second principle, I think, is even more important. The archive has a vested interest in keeping our data sets alive after we're dead. And that is a major problem that we face otherwise. Why am I not saying the University of Tasmania or the University of New England should do that? It's because they have universities have a shocking record of when people leave, of not honouring the research, because there's a new agenda in, they're interested in new research questions, so they just archive something, don't keep it alive. So and there's another reason for doing all of this, which is that this is an iterative process. And I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but I'll start with an observation. If you want to make a groundbreaking historical discovery, start by looking for files, which are described in the archive as MISC. Because if the file just says miscellaneous on it, miscellaneous correspondence, it means that nobody has indexed it, so nobody has accessed it. And of course, what we are about is covering those gaps. So by handing the records back to the custody of the state archives and our library system, that what you will do is enable other researchers, people like Meg Keneally, for example, to discover our past in more and more detail. This is Trove writ large. And I'm also, like many historians, really worried about the other way of doing digital research. So this is the kind of, let's not be forensic, let's just do a bit here and a bit there. So you press the gold key that says search on your computer and you get hits there. But of course you never know, because you're not in the archive, what you're missing. I think we're all worried about that. And of course we also don't know the context because we haven't read the entire shelf of stuff. Now, actually, of course, you could never do that because you went up to the archive and you got a file and you don't know which ones were the other side of that. So I think the digital archive can be even better than the original. I think that we all have an interest in doing this.
Hamish, can I just make a comment on that now? State Records New South Wales brought in a rule some years ago where if you called up a letter, they removed it from the box and brought it to you. Because I've been known there for centuries, I used to insist on the box. Now, with COVID, they're bringing the boxes up again.
Yeah.
There was a concern that people would put them back in the wrong place.
Yes.
But with a little bit of common sense and turning the pages, that is now, you get a whole box.
Yeah.
And that's the context exactly, because you don't know what's on either side of it.
Yes.
And when you get a whole box, you can actually go through every letter.
Yes. And of course, we can do that digitally as well. It's not quite the same thing, but we can get quite close. And then, of course, you don't have the problem of something getting out of order. We can preserve the order. My other nightmare is what's happened in the UK. It's also happened in Australia, but less so. So this is that the archives strike deals with Ancestry and Find My Past. So then what happens is I might be interested in occupation. And if I search Ancestry, in fact, actually you find that what they've done is that they've digitized name and age, but not the other bits on the record. And so in order to, I mean, literally all I've got to do, I have to pull up the record and search through it and actually do a transcription, another transcription. And I've got to pay for the privilege of wading through a clunky interface that doesn't do what I want it to do, because it's got one purpose and that's it. And I think one of the challenges for all of us as researchers is when we digitize things, we want to put them together for multi-use. So they're as useful as possible. And that takes a lot of thinking about how we should go about things. One of the things the historians say about me is that I go for the least interesting records, births, deaths, and marriages. Convict records, they're not particularly interesting convict records. These big registers. And I think that it makes sense to go for those first, because I call this the frame of the nation. There's something very important that happens if you look at all registered births, so civil registered births, and then we get the Catholic baptisms and we line the two up, suddenly we can see the unregistered. So it's the only way of seeing the hole in the archive, is to do this. And one of the projects that I admire enormously is underway at the moment in Dublin. So many of you will know about the Four Courts Fire. So in the Irish Civil War in 1922, a country was born into existence by destroying its archive. What a great tragedy. They're now rebuilding it digitally. Because there are a lot of copies of records in other archives. They're bringing them back together and they're trying to find the gaps, the stuff which is lost forever. So it's incredible what you can do, but we can go further than that. We can then look at a suburb and a street and a household. And what we've done is we've put that household into context of all of the other records. That's something really important to be able to do. So I would, although I want to concentrate on things like births, deaths, and marriages and convict records to start with, I think that when you start putting diaries in, and the individual in the diary can be linked to the, you come up with something very special. And I have a phrase for this. I think that what we're doing is we're building a frame for the nation. I think that's something to be very proud of. And the final one of these is, let's actually think about the archival process. So archivists have a terminology. And one of the things that I've discovered in working with archivists is that I'm becoming an archivist, and the archivists who work with me say, that's funny because we think we're becoming historians. It's a lovely process. I mean, that kind of like transfer between the two. But they'll tell me that a document is the original. And a document only becomes a record when it has an archival description attached to it. It's just by working together. If we develop a system where we can trust each other, work together, work collaboratively, work in a democratic way, then we end up with something very, very special. And this is what a coding dictionary looks like. They're really boring. So it's a small section of the one that we did for the descriptions of offences in conduct records. What it does is it shows you 4 different coding schemes that we have for that. So this is the one with absent. And most of the codes are the same all the way down. But what we can do with this is that, because this has every unique value that we have in the data set, if we get a similar data set, we'll run the coding dictionary against it, and it will code up every observation in exactly the same way. So if we were to run coding dictionaries like this across, let's, for example, just say the ABD, the winding sheet, and the Port Macquarie records that we have at UNE, they'll all talk to each other because they're all marked up in the same way, because there's a common coding system. And suddenly you've got something that's much more powerful than those individual bits.
Sorry. What do you mean by cloning?
It's a really, really good question.
I mean, can I just frame it a little bit? One of my relatives lied on birth certificates and things. She was hiding a secret. If I've discovered, should I be letting people know that this is no longer that person?
Yes, okay, so there are two issues here. And let me try and work our way around two of them. Both of them are really, really important issues. What we try to do in our team with the transcription is try to convey faithfully what's on the original record. But often that's unanalyzable. So for example, we'll have Betty down as a first name. And so in the cleansed version of that, we will put down a code for Elizabeth. So the cleansed one is not what's in the original record, but it's something which helps us to analyze the record. So we might have a date that's written in the record in an original or in one way. In the cleansed version, we will put it into an analyzable date so that it makes sense. Now, the second issue, which I think is really, really important, is that sometimes we discover some things which we need to put a note in so that other people know, or we need to conceal because there's an ethics issue. Both of those things, I think that I don't have easy answers for those. We are working, we have a Palawa, so it's the Aboriginal community in Tasmania, we have a Palawa representative on our board to try and work out how we can deal with data that's sensitive. But I mean, obviously that, in fact, actually I'll tell you a real story. So I work very closely with the men's health team at the University of Tasmania, and they tell me they have two versions of their database. So one is families as the families tell them that the family is ordered, and the other one is how they know that the family is genetically ordered. And there's a great deal of secrecy about the second one for very obvious reasons. And so some of those kind of issues are going to have to be thought through really deeply. So just really quickly, because I don't want to take up time, but this is what, yeah.
In my family history, it was taken down from the website because of privacy issues. But some people want family history that was kind of like, but I just found that interesting in terms of what was coming up. But in terms of that transcription and everything else, you still need it back to the original document. So people can see that and compare what they.
Yes. Yep. Richard, that's a really interesting observation. That we sometimes I use the phrase arming the bomb. So we can have all of the records, when we link them together, we actually create issues. But the unlinked records are inert. What we do at the moment with the Tasmanian archives, I think it's very cunning. We give them all of the record linkage. And so when you do a search on John Smith, it might pull out Betty Brown, because we know that Betty Brown married John Smith, but it won't tell you that the reason why it's pulled it out is because of a marriage that's up to you to discover. So the linkage is there, but it's not made explicit. Because as a researcher, it's up to you to establish whether that's a correct link or not. And I think that's a very clever way of getting around some of those problems. We won't get around all of them, but it will get around some of them. But at times we will need to conceal information that will be in the basement, so the data set that the research team has access to, but possibly not in the public version. this is what all of the female convict data looks like. This is 67,000 encounters with magistrates' benches. But to work with that data, we have to do something quite interesting with everyone. I'm just going to take you through what we do with a line of very boring data. And so what you can get out of this. This is Hannah Riles. And on January the 24th, 1832, when assigned to somebody called Chiltern, she was charged with neglect of duty and insolence, and she was given 3 months in the crime class in the factory. And somebody called H.B. Tulese was the magistrate. So the black numbers are the codes. AI Archives Index, that is her number in the Tasmanian Archives. And we use their numbers because we want everything to go back to them. So we coded up the dates. We have a code for the time that she spent. Those are the blue numbers. We have an employer ID for Chiltern. We have an offence code, which you just see for the neglect of duty, and we have a different one for insolence. And we have a location code for the female factory. And we have a magistrate's code for Tulese. So let's then see what we can do there. Let's build some layers on this. So there he is, Mr. Richard Chiltern. And there he is linked to his property, Loreni Parish. And there we can actually put it down on a map. So we've got that geolocation. And what's driving this is not the original transcript. This is the cleansed data and the codes. And this is only going to work if all of us have the same codes. We've got to share the same coding systems, which is a bit difficult because this is like video, that beta and VHS. And, the trouble is when you get common standards, they suck. So we're going to have to negotiate a way of getting a common standard and agreeing that we're going to work with all of the kind of problems that's going to come with that. Because if one of us is speaking Welsh and the other one is speaking Gaelic, then it's not going to work. Well, we can go on here. There are all of the other convicts that are at that property at the same time. There's the magistrate. There's where the magistrate lives. So we've now got the kind of distance that people are travelling. And there's the road that she would have walked down. And in fact, we can tell you whether it was raining in Hobart that day. So, and I think that's the kind of level that we want to get to, but there needs to be a discipline attached to the record. So transcript, and then the cleansed transcript, then all of the codes, and all linked back to the original and the image. This is just a kind of like another quick example, and then I'm nearly finished, I promise. This is the birth record. There's actually quite a lot of information in births, but in this case, the informant's details allow us to link this record to the valuation roll for that year. And that is important because this came up earlier, we've gone from district of registration to household. And we know the value of the house in this case. And we know the parents, they're both former convicts. And we can, there's an international coding scheme for historical occupations. We actually had a code in it for cowkeeper, which is his occupation. It's interesting to have a cowkeeper in the centre of Hobart anyway. But then we can pinpoint that house on a map. But then we know something, another lovely piece of information. We know that they're renting because they don't own the house, and E. Howard owns the house. So we want a complete tree on who E. Howard is. But then, of course, we can look at the neighbours, and we've got the values of all of the houses up and down the street, so you can have these neighbourhood effects. Then that child, it's the sad bit, dies of erysipelas, in fact, erysipelas in the head. So we have that death. We can look at all deaths in that suburb. We can look at the temperature, the weather conditions when they died. We can look at the paper and see whether there were floods at the same time. And you can get absolutely forensic with this. In fact, Julie Goff, the Aboriginal researcher that I work with, says to me, I was saying this to John Heath earlier, she says, to me, the past was a crime scene. Now it's time to get forensic. And this is what we're doing with all of these different data sets. And in fact, that is the weather pattern for 19th century Hobart, pieced together from the daily reports published in the newspaper. Nobody had done this. Nobody had gone back through and got this is every single day. So I'm now just going to take a wee bit of time, if that's okay with you, and show you some of the mapping that the archaeologists that we work with have done. And I think some of this is just stunning. So I'll just pause if anybody's got any questions. And if not, yes, we got one at the, go for it, Rex.
Hamish, with the coding, I was just curious though, you've obviously assigned a number of codes. Is that sort of an ongoing process? And how do you accomplish that? Like someone comes across a piece of data that hasn't been previously coded, you go through a committee, you have a round table discussion. That must be a fairly time-consuming process.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I just want to answer that as well. A great example is the human equals work on its own coding system for magisterial punishments. It may be that you've done another one as well, which would be, sort of a breakdown in communication. So what do you do with those circumstances where, you have different cases? If you will see how it can match integrated, or just one gets discarded,
You're trying to.
Remember Rex's question, what is, new information you have to hand later with things add into the code system.
So I think the coding dictionaries become a thing in their own right, and they've got to be publicly available for this to work. So when you find that the entry you've got is not in the coding dictionary, which will happen very frequently, I think what you've got to do is to add a code for it. And so therefore you're going to need to know how the coding structure works. And that means that we'll probably have to have lots of meetings like this, in order to discuss what we're going to do. Now, you'll notice with this that we've got 4 coding systems running in parallel.
Yes.
So all a coding system is a way of seeing the world. I often use the analogy of the London Tube map, which does a particular job. It tells you the sequence of stations. What it doesn't do is tell you the distance between the stations. So it may well be that you need another coding scheme to answer another question, in which case you add it to the record. So you can see here that you could use this file to automatically code another file 4 ways. So it's not a problem if we've got different coding systems, that they have to talk to each other. And this is like a scaffolding knuckle joint. It'll join bits of the record together. They are really important.
Yeah, but as far as possible, we all want to have one code system to use. So we possibly need to have some sort of repository or forum. In our case, we should publish our codes within sitting there waiting to use. But this is where communication becomes important, to actually have maybe a body, a sort of point body that's responsible for generating coding systems.
Yes. Absolutely. And the first principle is look to see if there's an international code, because you should use that if there is one. But then,
because what we found was that the codes weren't easily applicable to convicts who were under their own sort of status code, because they're convicts, they're liable to different types of punishments. So it is, and we found this with ISCO work codes as well, which are international violence and work codes.
Yes.
You need some adjustment to suit the circumstances of convicts in Australia.
yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think finding the platform where we publish the codes for New South Wales is going to be really, really important. And it may be that that's a job that UNE can do, but we'll look at it. Well, one of the things that attracts me to UNE is it wears 2 hats. That it's also a New South Wales Regional Archive. And if it's the Regional Archive that's publishing the codes, I think that's actually a really important role. This is done by Richard Tuffin and Martin Gibbs, and it just blows my socks off. So they've mapped every single public works station in Tasmania, given it a unique code, and shown how it operates over time. And they've linked it to the correspondence files in the archive that have images of the plans. So it means that we can now take those codes and run them through the conduct data records and put people into individual punishment stations. So what they've done here, I've taken some screenshots of animated screenshots of this in action. They've also done another one for Port Arthur. But now you'll see, we'll wind it back, and you'll see the government stations over time and the road network as it develops. But what you can do is drill down into this. So this is a bit clunky because, oh, come on. Yeah, now we're going to zoom down into this. It's going to take a little bit of a while to go. Yeah, here we go. So they use a vector-based system, which I know nothing about. It's beyond my pay grade, but it means that you can zoom in and in. So you can see Hobart emerging there. We can put everything on this. And by the way, they're working on one of these for New South Wales. So this is the floor plan for a future archive. Now I'm trying to zoom in on a particular station, the Hulk Chain Gang. Now what's lovely about this is you can put the current street map view on. There we go. That's the People's Republic of Hobart. Now we're going to zoom in on, this is where the Hulk Chain Gang was. And now let's go to the next slide. So there, this is a screenshot of it. They have linked in the plan for it. So you can determine that one of the buildings is still there. But then we can attach the correspondence to that place. We can attach all the convicts to that place. It's another way of accessing data sets, which I think is really important. Now, this is the last slide I've got. I'm starting to think about what we're doing in Tasmania as a cube with 6 faces. So these are the faces. So it's the one that I came in on, longitudinal intergenerational research. That's what floats my boat, okay? But improved archival interface for the nation. University teaching. It's really important actually because we need to train the next generation of digital historians and archaeologists. Heritage management. Secondary school teaching. Very similar reasons, but I mean, you can make people digitally literate by understanding their own past as well. Make them historically literate and digitally literate at the same time. And then this one I think is really interesting, heritage tourism. So somebody does some research online and they end up at Port Macquarie and they decide to visit. And when they visit, you're using the archive to create something very special for that experience. So those are all of the reasons why I think that we should do this. People like David and I can only do it in partnership with organisations like you and with the aid of individual researchers. And so the round table part of this is the discussion about how we move forward. Maybe just say one more thing. If there's anything really special to launch, it's the news that we have almost completed the process of registering a not-for-profit organisation in Tasmania called Digital History Tasmania. So there's a committee on it. The secretary, the rules say the secretary always has to come from the estate archives. The committee is made up of Indigenous researchers, family historians, people who represent industry partners and university academics. And it has a set of guidelines for running it, but it's the management group for the archive. So I think that's one way of going forward, is to share that approach. But on that stage, I'm going to shut up and just listen to feedback, etc., etc. I mean, the first thing is this worth doing? And then if we think it is worth doing, how do we go about it? Do we just use the Tasmanian template? Do we need to create a different one?
Well, no, yes, we'll do it. Well, no, that's right. I mean, it's we started this 10, 12, 15 years ago. Technologists. So.
Hamish, so that you're online.
Well, I'll say, well, I'm just going to facilitate open to see if anybody.
Yeah. So you have to stand here.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I'm going to, and we can open up to our friends on Zoom. I think via a chat. If you see a good question come in, we'll take it. But yeah, I just want to, I guess, open up to the floor now for any comments or suggestions. Okay. Any comments, suggestions, and perhaps you might like to tell us about some of the things you're working on. For example, Rex, you want to tell us about the data sets that you're compiling. Everyone else might have already heard it, but not everyone has. Yeah, we'd like to hear about some of the research that is going on here. John.
Yeah, I just have the questions, and I think one of them touches on the point that was made. I'm forgetting now, sorry, by Mike a little bit earlier. Two aspects of that. One is the generational histories, and the second is the heritage management. So my question is, how do we develop effective ethics procedures around those two issues?
So the question for people who are zooming in is how do we develop ethical procedures for managing intergenerational record linkage and heritage management? I don't think there are any easy answers to this. I think that what we have to do is just progress slowly. I don't think that there are any easy answers. I think we have to progress slowly, test the waters a bit, listen, do a lot of listening, be prepared to eat humble pie when people react. One of the things that I think is really, really important is that there is no correct way of assembling the past. We don't know what happened, and that's one of the challenges that we're going to get. So if we say that two records are linked and somebody says that they're not, that is going to, I think, create problems. So one of the ways around that is to have very good signals that those things are going to happen. And another way that we ought to, another thing that we ought to do is look at the processes that are already in place. So there is a set of care guidelines for, a set of FAIR guidelines for how to do ethical databases. There's a set of care guidelines, which are the First Nation protocols for how to do that. I think both of those need to be read very carefully. And if we have any common website, so let's say, for example, that we did end up forming a Digital History New South Wales, that would have those principles right up the top.
Where's the X?
Yes.
Maxwell. Back in 2011, when Yvonne and I first started the project to write the stories about the names on the tiles at the swimming pool right next door on the front wall, anybody who hasn't seen them and knows them, you should go and have a look. There were 393 tiles there. We come up with the idea of writing mini biographies about all of those families who back in 1965, 66 decided that they'd pay £5 to buy a tile and put their name on the wall. It was completed, and that money was used to help construct the amenity block at the swimming pool. So we spent about six or seven years writing that. And while I was doing that, the only way we could do it, we tried to get the families to write a lot of the story. We couldn't. We got many people either didn't answer or we couldn't get hold of them. So we trawled through newspapers, we trawled through electoral rolls, we trawled through BDM records to try and gather all this information, to write the story, to try and give some substance to just the name rather than having a name. Who were these people who were generous? Remembering back in 1965 that £5 was a lot of money for most of the working class, maybe the business people and the rich people, but maybe it wasn't so much. But so out of that come my desire to build a database of names of people connected to Port Macquarie. And over the years, I've basically, as a one-man band, and help from some of the volunteers at Port Macquarie Family History Society, we've just continued to add records to that, and focused on that database contains all of the pre-1900 electoral rolls for the area, plus a lot of the modern ones I'm working on currently. I just finished the 1941 electoral rolls for the electorate of Cowper, and they are in, the names and data is in discrete fields. I don't know if that means too much to you, Hamish, you understand that, or it's not just a single line. That involves scanning or copying the pages from the electoral rolls, which are terrible font. Quite often they are blurred, they are difficult, so I have to OCR them, which means optical character recognition, just the same way as Trove does with the newspapers. And then I have to go and manually edit them, read them out, try and make sure that the OCRing hasn't missed any, and then copy it to a spreadsheet, which then eventually used to convert to CSV file and upload it to a database for the technical people who need to know that. So I've got newspapers, entries in there. We read a lot of the newspapers from say that 1960 in Port Macquarie area, and we've got all of the names of obituaries, and we put those into this database. So that database now has got over 700,000 entries and about 935,000 names of people somehow connected to Port Macquarie or the Hastings Valley or in the general north coast area pre-1900, because the electoral rolls, they covered a much vaster area. And that's currently at the museum, which is used by the researchers there. It's used by the Port Macquarie Family Society researchers, David Fish loves it. And there's also a copy, an older copy at the Port Macquarie Library. The biggest issue is how to handle material which still might be in copyright. People who've done a lot of extracting information, because I tend to get a bit carried away when I see data, and I'd like to put it into the database so that we can just do one search and find all the records related to that person. And that's been an ongoing project of mine, and I'll keep doing it for as long as I can. That's what I call the Port Macquarie bibliographical data. And a lot of those earlier electoral rolls particularly are linked to images of the electoral roll itself. So if you go and call up Fred Smith, you can see where his name appears in the electoral roll. There are lots and lots of different records, but I can talk to people later about if they want to know how many records, what type of record sets are involved.
We'll do that.
That raises the three, I think, key issues raised by Rex and also by John, which I can talk very briefly about. One is that it is possible to have different visualizations, so different versions of things. And that may be useful for some of these thorny questions. So there may be a version of things that only an Indigenous researcher group can see, so that everybody can access all of the bits and pieces of data, but there's a way of linking them together which only a certain group of people get access to. And that may solve some problems. The second thing that we can do is, it takes a bit of getting your head around this, but when we link the records, that they're momentarily linked by an electronic kind of tag. The records don't change. And what we can do is preserve in the database all of the potential links. And that information is actually quite helpful. So if you're trying to find Tamsin and there are two possible hits, we can say that this one, we're 95% certain that the one that you should be looking for is here, but there is this one over here, and there's a 15% possibility that it's her. So that's a way of not saying there's one way through all of this tree, that there are multiple ways. It's making everybody aware that this is not the truth. It's the way our past is represented in the archive and what we've made of that. And the third thing, which I think is very important, and I should have said something about this earlier, is that it's very important moving forward, and we still don't do this in Tasmania to the extent that we should. It's very important to keep track of the energy and time and industry that everybody's put into this. Now, there is an international university system for doing this. It has the wonderful name of ORCID. So it's an original researcher identifier something or other, it's called. We can give everybody in this room an ORCID. It's a little electronic tag. And so that whenever you complete a record, adjust a record, your ORCID is there. And so then when anybody uses that record, then they know, well, they should be citing that orchid. So that they are, it's keeping sight of, everybody. There's also another reason for doing this, that if you think that somebody just completely made a mess of a set of records, then you can identify them as well. Or you know that somebody's a really good researcher. So it's a way of actually making this not anonymous. And something that I'm very conscious of is that when I publish a paper, there's a limit to how many names can go on that. And if 200 people have contributed to it, how do you acknowledge those people? So I think that these are, none of this is insurmountable, but they're things that need to be thought of very carefully.
Both David and Hamish have asked me to speak a little bit about the biographical database of Australia, which was set up by Keith Johnson and Malcolm Sainty, who any of you who've done genealogy since the 1960s will have heard of. They did the GRDs. They were the Library of Australian History and published over 100 facsimile titles and books on early colonial Australia, written by some quite famous historians or people who had written about that particular era since. They set up the biographical database of Australia in order to move into the digital age from the hard copy GRDs and material that they had done for many years. The first GRD being the Genealogical Research Directory, for those of you who went around in '89, I think it was, when they did the first one, which was a small volume, through to the last GRD, which I can't remember when, was about 25 years later, which is a big, huge red volume. What they did was to try and identify people who paid a certain amount of money to have their family history name put in it, and in the back there was a listing of the contributor's name and their postal address. We're talking pre-email, pre-mobile phone, so that if you found a name, say Hamish Maxwell-Stewart from Edinburgh, in a certain period of time, and he was someone to do with your family history, you could write to him and set up a correspondence. So the biographical database in Australia was to move on from that. So they started out by inputting the material that they had done in the censuses, which they published, and all your libraries will have those, the 19th century musters. They were some of the first material that went into the biographical database, and they have moved on since then to parish registers and all manner of other material, including the New South Wales convict indents, which have been input by various genealogical researchers. The catchphrase for this kind of material that Hamish is doing is there is no link to original records. Now that is partly because they started this, I guess it was, I can't remember now, about 10 years ago now, I guess, and that facility wasn't available. Also, Keith and Mal are of my generation who were not particularly computer literate when they began this, and so it is all transcriptions of material. Many of you will have used it. It's a subscription website, $35, $38. And the idea is for them to link people who are the same, which is easy enough to manually do if it's, Perry McIntyre on the Brampton as a convict. But it is an ad hoc kind of a process, depending on their very knowledgeable genealogical background. Many of the linkages have yet to be done. Where it's going in the future, I'm not sure. Why I'm sitting here is, besides Keith Johnson and Al Sainty, myself, Dr. Carol Liston from the University of Western Sydney, and Michael Flynn, who wrote the Second Fleet book and has done a remarkable amount of work on early convicts, First and Second Fleet, are on the committee. And what Keith and Mel wanted to do is have it as a legacy for themselves for the future, so that it continues after their death. Now, Hamish and I drove up from Sydney yesterday and talked about how we might be able to, that he might be able to talk to Keith and Mel about this project for New South Wales, hosting that so it does become a legacy for them. And with the more modern technology, how it can link to digital images. Now, I haven't spoken to Keith and Mel about that, so I don't want you to all go home tonight and email them and say, Terry's just outed, because I would then be outed. It was just a thought we had that it might be a way of continuing what they've started and linking it in, excuse the pun, linking it into this material so that it doesn't have to be rekeyed and can then automatically, by correspondence and negotiations with State Records New South Wales, where a great majority of this material is, including the convict indents, the tickets of leave for New South Wales SID. And then some of us can go back, as many of you know, I indexed the tickets of leave for New South Wales many years ago, but I only did the name and convict ship. I would be happy and mad, but happy to go back now and key the material that relates, that's also on the face of the ticket of leave, the annotations, which you all know. So that's about it as far as the biographical database is concerned. I encourage anybody to pay the $35, or the society can pay more than that. I think the society has to pay more money, but because what it is doing is actually keeping it alive. Keith and Mel have put almost every penny of their lives into this. So as they age and run out of money, I don't know what will happen to them. And it is my concern that something like this, and Rex's material that he's just spoken out about, will die with the people who created it, unless a bigger organisation, perhaps like State Records or Archives Tasmania, take it on, that are a stable organisation that's not going to change what universities do. It's not going to die with us individuals. And to be fair, it's not going to go into redundancy because suddenly we're all too old and the Port Macquarie Family History Society folds and the material that goes, because it could happen. We don't know what that sort of future holds. But we do know that archives, with permission from states and governments, hopefully, will continue to collect data in perpetuity and retain what we have already saved from the past.
Can I make two quick, it was fantastic. Can I make two quick points to reinforce what Perry is saying? The first one is the best way to keep Trove alive is to use it and add stuff to it. The second is that there is another way of skinning the cat when it comes to things that people have spent a lot of time doing and already have as a commercial operation. So one of the other projects that I was involved with was the Digital Panopticon, which is a British-funded, huge, multi-million-dollar project to mash together 60 criminal justice data sets. Some of those were contributed by Ancestry and Find My Past. And the way that worked is that when you hit that record in a search, it would say this record comes from Ancestry. If you've got an Ancestry subscription, just click this button and it will go through. If not, sign up. So we could have BDA involved in a public thing, but behind a paywall that works like that. And it would say front up, you should pay your $38 to get the max out of us. So there are more ways than one of approaching many of these problems. And I think that one of the things that's really important going forward is for people to understand that there are going to be challenges, and it's not helpful to say, you can't do that. What is helpful to say is that there is a potential problem here. Let's think about how to solve it.
Okay, so just to recap, Perry has offered to transcribe the rest of the ticket of leave. Is anyone else want to make a contribution to the discussion? If not, I think what we take away is that when you look at the BGA, if you look at what Rex is doing and everything in between, these sorts of big data sets are underway and have been going on in New South Wales for 5 or 6 years. So what we're going to need is a way of us all coordinating and contributing our data into sort of a common database using common protocols and techniques, and that's going to be the future of digital history in New South Wales by everyone who practices it, is what I'm thinking. Now, I will control that, but I'm also happy to be part of a larger.
Yeah. I just want to make a passing comment. Many of you in this audience who've known me for 40 years know that I had a science background. I first did a science degree at UNE. But my steps into history were through the excitement of finding documents. It was the documents that I discovered doing my family history that led me into being a historian. And so I'm probably in a perfect position to be able to sit here as a quasi-academic, only because I've got a PhD, and a family historian to say what we all need to think about is academics aren't here to steal family historians' material, because there was a perception of that, and there is probably still a perception of that among some family historians. But on the other side of it, family historians are probably some of the best contributors, and Hamish has made that clear, towards the overview history that academic historians and professional historians are able to write. Because without that minutiae that genealogists do, it's impossible for anyone to go down those rabbit holes to that extent and still be alive at the end of it in time to write something. So I just wanted to say what this is about is a collaborative sharing process. And if anyone's got issues with that, I think that between David and Hamish and Tamsin, they can sort out any political or moral issues that any of you or us might have.
Okay, thanks. Well said. Hamish, what do you want?
I've got a suggestion to make. I think it's one of the things I've always tried to get with the researchers that I mentor in universities to think about is you should have a 5-year plan. Sorry, that sounds a bit socialist, but you should be thinking about what you're going to do. Right. Yeah. But then the second thing to do is to work out the steps to get there. And one very logical step, this isn't up to me to decide, it's up to you guys. But one very logical step is it's fairly obvious that Port Macquarie district is way ahead of many, many other areas. You have transcribed hundreds of thousands of records for this district. Now, we also have some data, particularly for the convict era for here. We don't need to wait for a New South Wales train to leave the station. That we could work with you to see what happens when you start to bring different data sets together. How do you start to make them talk? And that can be a project that we can all control together. And there's nothing like getting your hands dirty to try and work out what the problems are that you're going to encounter on a bigger scale. And I would just be delighted to be part of that, because apart from anything, I get to come to this beautiful part of the world again.
We are in fact back in September. So.
Yes, apparently it's virtual in September.
Oh, is it? Okay. We'll be watching nonetheless. Finance and there have been some developments, and in the follow-up of this event, we'll keep discussing these issues. I might thank Hamish. I didn't have much to do with this, but Hamish and Perry and anyone else who contributed, thank you very much.
Well, before we go, I noticed that there's some pretty remarkable people online. I recognise some of the names. Are there any? If anybody wants to put a type of question, I've just got my eye on the chat line. And in the meantime, while we're waiting to see whether anybody does, any more thoughts from?
Your history on ancestry and it's wrong. Very wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, I got my grandfather marrying a lady over Charles Kempsey, and it's his cousin, second cousin, that married that lady. You know, there's things like that. It's just, they don't research
I think
properly.
that's a wild case of getting family tree wrong.
Oh, yes, you know, when there's 21 children on one man's family do marriages, you know, and if you don't know them, you start, lots of things like that.
Well, again, there's no easy answer, but if we're putting together the data set collectively, then we can make sure as a group that we're happy with what we've got. And at times we will get conflicts, but you can put the equivalent of a sticky note on the record to say 2 people see this one differently. So you click on this one to get this version, click on that one to get this version. These are the reasons. So again, it is a big problem, but I think it's one that we can clutch our way around.
Yep, I totally agree. If I could just make a comment on ancestry, I am, one of my small projects is chasing 114 workhouse famine orphan girls that came to New South Wales between 1848 and 1850. And of course, I check the trees on ancestry. And you're absolutely right. Some of them are fantastic. Some of them are, to be very polite, abysmal. What you need to do is ignore the abysmal and maybe contact, if it's your family, the people who have done a good job and say great job, because I don't think the internet in any form is a place to abuse people. And it is actually ignorant research. The beauty of ancestry, apart from the family history trees, is all the other material they have up there, the digitised material. And apart from a quick check on a tree, I often just use what's up there as material, because it is a quick way into archival material.
I think there's another wider point here that can be made. Of course, not every record, we've already touched upon this, not every record links as easily as another record. So we touched on common name issue. And of course, there's a very strong class distribution with this, because the more important people think they are, the more distinguishable their names. And the more likely you are to have a middle name in the past, for example. But what we haven't talked about is the way that age is reported and how that can affect record linkage. So there's a strong correlation between age heaping, so saying you're 30 or 40 or 35, and illiteracy. And this means it's harder to link the records for the illiterate than the literate. And so biases enter into archives, which are actually quite nasty, because they're systematically discriminating certain people. And if we're in control over the process, we can at the very least point this out to people. So this is John's ethics issue. If there was an organisation that was running this, that's working with the State Archives and Library Service, then it can put up these issues, it can have bulletin boards, it can discuss them, etc., etc. So it can't solve them, but it can go some way to pointing people to. Some historians talk very powerfully about this. The archive is not neutral. It was a bureaucratic tool that was designed to do certain things. One of its big problems is if your family had large encounters with, or many encounters with the court system, they're going to be easy to follow than the ones that kept their noses clean. Yeah. And so, again, that's another issue. So pointing out how people are represented in the archive, I think, is going to be a very important way of going forward. One last comment on very much in that vein. I'd have to talk to my committee, but I can't see any problem with creating a login for the Port Macquarie Family History Society to the Digital History Tasmania I think it would be important for you to see what we've done, warts and all.
Yeah.
And say, I wouldn't do it that way. That's actually really, really good feedback. So I'll organise that. Okay. Oh, sorry. And it's quite complicated to navigate round. So that offer also comes with, I will appear on Zoom and do a tour of the database as well, to show you how to use it.